cold in the earth. And 15 wild Decembers from those brown hills have melted into spring. Faithful indeed is the spirit that remembers after such years of change and suffering.
Brontë country it's called, the Yorkshire moors famous as the home of the Brontë sisters and the background of their novels. This is how they knew it in winter, cold and desolate. But what happens to a place when it becomes famous as the home of a great writer? And do the visitors who come on literary pilgrimage to this parsonage destroy what it is they seek? A glimpse of Haworth as the Brontës themselves knew it.
I have come here as a Brontë enthusiast myself to find out why so many feel as I do. For Haworth is second only to Stratford in the number of tourists it attracts. It was after the early death of their mother and their two elder sisters that Charlotte, Emily, Anne and Bramwell created a secret imaginative life of their own together. As young children, they all wrote tiny books, developing the literary skills that were to blossom in their adult work. And then in just 2 years, between 1847 and 1849, those three young women published 5 novels, 2 of them masterpieces. Jane Eyre by Charlotte, which was an instant bestseller, and Wuthering Heights by Emily, never acknowledged a masterpiece in her own lifetime.
I think the stories are terrific, yeah. And the biographies are terrific too, when you read each one of the biographies. They're very good and interesting. And when you think of all this snow and ice and round here and coldness, you know, and what they suffered, because they did suffer, each one of them, in their own way.
Yes, and seem to see the Wuthering Heights films about 6 times. It's all very lovely, you know.
When one has been involved with something for an awful long time, I think that physical contact with the sorts of things that they had physical contact with is rather important. I think one can get emanations.
Emanations, that's what people want. But the parsonage is now the Brontë Museum, and museums are about things, not feelings. Still, if possessions interest you, there's plenty that's authentic. Emily's sampler, made when she was 10, hangs in what was once her room. The walls have traces of childish scribble, but the atmosphere's mostly cold and formal. Emily's painting of her dog, Keeper, and his wide brass collar, set on display in one of many glass cases. Only occasionally does some small, broken personal object fire the imagination to remember a small, skinny child destined to be one of our greatest visionary writers, and there's no challenging its authenticity. The kitchen's a different matter, altered to accommodate further museum space. A copy of Charlotte's portrait by Richmond, and many of the miniature books they wrote about invented countries and heroes. Much has survived because they were already famous in Charlotte's lifetime, so people hoarded keepsakes and childhood paintings once their property came up for sale. What's more, their fame was extended by their father, the Reverend Patrick Brontë, who commissioned the novelist Mrs. Gaskell to write Charlotte's biography. His study remains unchanged. Here he led his solitary life, reading, eating his meals alone. He himself had risen from poverty in Ireland to a degree at Cambridge and his own modest literary hopes. Painting was their brother Bramwell's ambition. He was the spoilt darling, the one expected to be a genius. He never made it. Instead, he became the local drinking boyo, declining into debts, drugs, and early death. His most famous picture is of his 3 devoted sisters. If it's hard to imagine their life inside the parsonage, it's easy to imagine their death. Death was on their doorstep. It was to haunt much of their writing. They themselves were to die young. Bramwell, who had lost his job as tutor because of a scandalous affair with the boy's mother, died aged 30. There's no evidence he ever knew his sisters had published a word. Within 3 months, Emily, denying she was ill at all, died of consumption, aged 29. 6 months more, and Anne, only 28, died of the same. She had travelled to Scarborough in hope of a cure and is buried there. Charlotte survived, and then, 5 years later, in the face of her father's opposition, she married his Irish curate, Arthur Bell Nichols. They lived in the parsonage, but their happiness was brief, for within a year Charlotte died. She was 38 and some 3 months pregnant. You certainly feel the chill of early death in the churchyard, but the church that stands there now and the trees were not there then. Only the original tower remains. In the village itself, the main road is new. The winter weather is as grim as ever. The empty streets, cobbles carefully preserved, look much as they always have. The steep hill, the old buildings are the same. You catch the flavour of Victorian life, or so you think. The Black Bull, Bramwell's favourite haunt, still stands, with only the yellow parking line to give the date away. And with no one but yourself on the Brontë trail, Haworth can be full of ghosts. Ghosts, your own thoughts, and just a few locals. Come the summer, and things are different. The fame of the little hill village has spread far and wide and brought the tourists, trade and traffic. What would those 3 reticent young women make of this? Their lives had been private, their home remote, and they liked it like that. Today, souvenirs, knickknacks, Brontë tweed, antiques, useful bits and pieces, useless junk clutter the streets every summer weekend. And among the bric-a-brac, the occasional memento of Haworth's past. Weaving shuttles, reminiscent of the handlooms which provided the living in so many of the cottages. To get their books published, they'd used the names Ellis, Acton and Currer Bell. No one knew who they were. They deliberately remained anonymous. How ironic, then, that all these people have heard of the Brontës, that Brontë business is booming and threatening to engulf even Haworth's own villagers.
All these houses you can see of the village, all these shops were houses. And now it's like Blackpool
Golden Mile.
Everybody who takes a house now, they come from Bradford and Leeds and London and all over. They've taken these houses over at ridiculous prices and converted them into shops where everything's sold from Hong Kong. And it's true, is this? And there's no villagers lives in the houses now. There's no houses for them, you see. And they've pushed the rents up sky high and the houses up sky high and everything.
Didn't they've spoilt it?
I think really they have spoiled it. Yes. When we came here 40 years, it was a beautiful little village. And now it's just commercialised.
And you've got 4 shops in Haworth?
Yes, small ones.
What sort of things they sell?
Well, we range really from the smallest type of gift to the more expensive stag skin, shetland wool, that sort of thing.
Do you think there's a danger of having little shops like this spoiling the atmosphere?
I don't think so, because when I first came here, the street was such a mess. There was such a lot of property which really wanted something doing with it and just wasn't being done. That really, it's helped. It's tidied up a lot.
What sort of things do you think the tourists want to buy?
Well, this varies with nationalities. The Americans particularly want something that's made in Haworth. And they seem to have an idea in their heads that every mortal thing is made in Haworth.
It's not, is it?
No, it isn't. I mean, industry here went out a long time ago. As I say, when I first came, there were very few shops up here, mostly for the local people.
Do you think there's a danger of the shops and the souvenirs spoiling Haworth?
Yes, I do. I do. I think unless it's very tastefully done, it can be rather grotty.
books are tastefully done in Haworth. Ever since Mrs. Gaskell, books about the Brontes have poured forth. They still do. Biographies of each, editions of the novels and the poems. The Brontes and Marxism and sexuality and women's lib. They're all on sale in the converted chemist shop where Bramwell bought his opium. When it comes to enjoying their books, does bookseller Joanna Hutton think their lives really matter?
I personally don't, and I get very fed up of this thing of trying to pin them down. I mean, in one breath we're saying they're geniuses, and in the other breath we're saying, well, we've got to find out why they wrote this as they did. Are they taking this from Haworth? Are they taking this from Hathersage? Are they taking this? Which seems to me ridiculous. I mean, if they had imagination, obviously they used it, and this was the genius part.
Do you think the Brontë business is getting out of hand?
I don't know. I often wonder what they'd think if they could come back today and see it all.
What would they think?
I think they could but be flattered. I mean, how would you feel yourself if you'd written these books in a very humble way and been poor all your life and never really benefited from any sort of the things of fame, and then to come back 100 more years later and see all these people flocking here because of what you've done? I mean, you could only be pleased, I think.
Can you tell me why it is you're queuing to see the Brontë parsonage?
There seems no other alternative to get in but to queue. That's largely the reason I'm queuing. But the Brontë sisters are becoming increasingly important, I think, in the general history of England and the general history of literature.
I should think if you stood here now and asked everybody who passed by, the visitors, who wrote Wuthering Heights, there isn't 1 in 10 who'd know.
Well, I'm a tourist. I came from Greece. Well, I have read the novels years ago, and I thought it was a good opportunity to visit the museum now, as I'm in England for 3 weeks.
Yes, I've read nearly all the books and I've read the biographies. You know, I think I found it really fascinating.
I've never really been here before, so obviously I'm not too sure, really.
Have you read the books?
Not really read the books, no.
Do you know a lot about them?
Just that they write, is that so?
Do you?
No, they're historic and that, you know, enjoy yourselves. It's nice
Just
around
have a
here
look
anyway.
to see the clothes and what they wore and things like that. I've been before, actually. This is the 3rd time.
Actually, we are on a tour of the Brontë country, and
well, we went to York, you see, and then this seemed the natural place to come after that, so...
Do you know a lot about the Brontes?
Other than reading Wuthering Heights, not really, but that...
yes, captivating book.
They're sort of compelling reading, and I like the moors, and I like like places like this. Anyway, as I say, they're very grim, but they're full of interest, well, to me.
Apart from casual visitors and local Yorkshire folk on a day's drive out into the country, there are, of course, the Brontë fanatics.
Why has Dr. Coggan turned it down?
Well, he just couldn't fit it in, you know. It's too much.
The Brontë Society is England's oldest literary society, exceeding even Dickens and Wordsworth societies for staying power. It was founded in 1893. Its annual meeting is addressed by a distinguished literary personage. It has an annual excursion to a Brontë landmark and an annual publication, the Brontë Transactions. Again, one wonders what Charlotte, Emily and Anne would think. So I asked its chairman, Mr. Oliver.
Well, we've often wondered that. I think they would be sympathetic towards what we try to do. I should think Emily really wouldn't want to know, would she? Because she disliked the very idea of her sister looking at her poems. But I think she would recognise how devoted we are to her and how many of the people who come here, including members of the society, are devoted to the moors which she loved. Charlotte, I think, would enjoy her fame and her continuing fame and the devotion which she attracts by scholars, which is very flattering, really.
Mrs. Weir, what's your favourite among the Brontes, your favourite of their works or of the thing that interests you most?
Oh, without question, Wuthering Heights and Emily's poems. It must be well over 50 years now since I first read Wuthering Heights. I couldn't tell you because I don't think at the age I was then you analyse the power of a book, the real power of a book. But it had some power on me because there's scarcely been a day, I think, since then when I hadn't thought about that book. And I went on from Wuthering Heights to the poems, which I still read with great emotion, very often, and shall probably be reading them on my deathbed.
You find that movie that important?
Yes, I do.
Of course, the Brontes are big business now, aren't they? Bringing in thousands a year.
Well, of course, the Society has a very large membership at home and abroad. And, of course, lots of people spend their weekends and even daytime leisure in visiting the house. And I think it attracts a lot of people who are not knowledgeable as far as literature are concerned, or even the Brontes, but I think they're interested in the Bronte scene, their lives, their difficulties, their problems, the little bit of social history, which has fascinated people for 100 years, I think.
Of course, the most the girls ever earned as governesses in a year was £100. What do you think they'd make of the income of the Bronte Society today?
I think they'd be quite pleased if they knew how we were spending it. It's all done on their behalf. I think possibly I agree with Mr. Oliver that Emily might have thought it was a slight intrusion, but I doubt it. I think it's spent wisely.
How many of the villagers belong to the society?
Oh, I wouldn't know.
I would think that we have about 30 in the actual village itself.
That's not many.
No, I don't think that there's a particular interest because they've been Bronte to death.
If you can fight your way through the jamboree in Main Street, the record of the Bronte lives is here for the finding. Here was once the gate through which they passed to church, Charlotte to her wedding, each to their funerals. Here lies Tabitha Aykroyd, for 30 years their loyal servant. But you will search in vain for a Bronte tomb in the churchyard. Strangely, with all the paraphernalia in the parsonage and all the junketing in the shops, their tomb, the family vault inside the church, is surprisingly modest and seemly, though there is a coloured slide for sale. Their family vault lies beneath the pavement. Their original pew, the original stone, went in the rebuilding. With all this changed, one living thing remains the same, the job of parson. Barry Ashdown is today's incumbent. Does he sense the presence of his famous predecessor?
In some respects, I think I do, yes, because Haworth, in many ways, hasn't changed very much since he was here, and you get the atmosphere of the place on certain occasions, and I do feel it sometimes, yes. I noticed one of the things, looking through the registers in Bronte's time, that he must have spent almost all his time either burying or baptising people, an enormous number. Of course, people very often died very young, and I don't have, fortunately, anything like the same number on that part of my work.
Haworth was no rustic Victorian idyll. It was a slum as bad as London's worst. No sewers, just open drains. The churchyard itself, overcrowded and ill-drained, was a source of infection. 2 in 5 babies died before the age of 6. The average age of death was 25 years. Today, the children who attend the church and then the Sunday school where Charlotte Bronte was a teacher are more healthy, live in better conditions. But that's not to say that the Brontes' early life was a misery, quite the contrary. Theirs was an intensely happy childhood. The family was close-knit, loving, their minds cast in the same mould. Their home remained the place they loved most. Emily was even ill with longing whenever she was away. Does it matter then that the tourists invade even the quiet of the church?
Well, I personally don't mind that. I know there are many people in the country who perhaps aren't regular churchgoers, but who nevertheless have a great interest in church buildings and church architecture. And obviously in a place like Haworth, there are going to be many people who visit here who want to see the church where Brontë was incumbent. And I'm personally quite happy for them to come and have a good look round.
So make them welcome, yes, though you have to draw the line at some things. Once the crowds depart, modern Haworth has to deal with its own kind of 20th century squalor. Not now the deadly traces of poverty, but the discarded debris of affluence. The wrappers and refuse of our leisure hours, left for the villagers to clear up. It takes their time, their trouble, and goes on the rates. How Miss Bramwell, the spinster aunt who brought up the orphaned Brontë children, would disapprove. She taught them neatness, cleanliness, punctuality. They would marvel at such municipal cleanliness, but such individual untidiness would shock them all. City dwellers and tourists who get beyond the village into the fields can even bring risks to the farms. They know no better than to let their dogs roam free. At lambing time, the farmers fear for their flocks. It's hard enough farming the moor as it is. There are fewer farms today. Many farmers have given up the unrewarding struggle and sought work in the valleys and towns. So farmhouses stand empty. The moors are bleaker now than ever they were in Emily's time. You'll only get this far if you're truly dedicated. And if you are dedicated, you won't want to miss it. Some 4 miles out from Haworth, across rough moorland, you come here to Top Withins, a ruined and deserted farmhouse imagined by many to be the original of Emily's Wuthering Heights. The situation is probably correct, but the building itself bears very little resemblance to her original. It was lived in until after the last war. Since then, time and the tourists have done their damage, stealing it stone by stone as souvenirs. In the end, it's her work that counts. But certainly Emily loved these moors. She was happier here than among people who found her remote, even unfriendly. But the moors inspired her novel and her poems to a pitch of almost mystical passion. Coming here, we get an impression of her life that illuminates what she wrote and the intensity of her vision.
I'll walk where my own nature would be leading. It vexes me to choose another guide. Where the grey flocks in ferny glens are feeding, where the wild wind blows on the mountain side. What have those lonely mountains worth revealing? More glory and more grief than I can tell. The earth that wakes one human heart to feeling can centre both the worlds of heaven and hell.
That, for me, is what this literary pilgrimage is about, to come to the places where the Brontës belonged, their home, their village, their landscape, and to try and know a little of what they knew. They travel beyond those limits, of course. There were visits to London and months spent in Brussels and as governesses in homes round about. But it was their isolation here, in this harsh, uncompromising part of Yorkshire, that nurtured their genius, fostered their writing, and in the end, killed them. Haworth, for all its coachloads and souvenirs, is a place hallowed by genius and tragedy. And finally, that is how it feels.